I grew up in a home where we never went away on holiday. My parents were poor, and so along with my brother and two sisters, we'd spend the long summer break from school at home, where my very creative mum found all sorts of inventive ways to keep us entertained. One of them was that each year she would buy us a huge jigsaw puzzle with at least 1,000 pieces. But these jigsaw puzzles were jigsaw puzzles with a difference. My mum bought them all from the second-hand shop at the top of our road, and they usually came in an old paper bag with no box and therefore no lid and therefore no picture, which was very confusing. I learned that it's very difficult to make a jigsaw when you don't know what the big picture is. I remember that I'd come across various bits of puzzle that I just couldn't place. It would drive me absolutely mad. Each day I'd end up looking at those same pieces, turning them around this way and that, and wondering where they fitted. And each day I'd fail. Somehow, however, miraculously, over the last few days of the school holiday, that jigsaw would always get finished. In fact, it took me years to realise that this was primarily due to our mother's nightly interventions after we'd gone to bed, perhaps with the help of the picture we never knew existed. But what I remember most was that invariably, when we finally did get to see the finished picture, two things were true. First, there were always a few pieces missing, pieces we just didn't have. And second, and very frustratingly, I'd realised that some of the pieces I'd spent the whole summer trying painstakingly to place just didn't belong at all. They'd somehow just got mixed into our puzzle at the second-hand store by accident. They belonged to a completely different jigsaw altogether. I grew up in a kind of church where I was taught that some of the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that make up the big picture of Christianity are things like this. If you have enough faith, everything will turn out wonderfully for you. If you don't have enough faith, everything will go wrong. God is all-powerful and always gets his own way. When people die early or tragically, it's because God has chosen to take them. It's his will and his timing for them. So just accept it. It's for the best. I was taught that the world was made in 6 days, just over 6,000 years ago, and that everyone who disagrees with this is wrong and so should be dismissed. Other parts of the jigsaw puzzle were preferring faith to reason, preferring censorship to debate, believing that when God looks at a human being, the first thing he sees is their sin and depravity rather than their goodness, believing that everyone who's not a Christian is going to burn in the abyss forever, believing that everyone who's the wrong kind of Christian is going to burn in the abyss forever, and of course opposing gay rights, opposing remarriage, opposing other faiths, and opposing atheists. But the way I see it now, none of these bits of puzzle fits into the big picture of Jesus' teaching. They've all come from a very different picture, a very different kind of box. I'd like to explain. Like every boy in his culture, Jesus spent much of his youth learning the Jewish law, as contained in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, sometimes known as the books of Moses. And he learned it well. In fact, his knowledge of it amazed even the leading teachers of his day. But as an adult, his own teaching, built on the strong foundation of having internalized it, went way beyond a rigid acceptance. So, as Matthew records in chapter 22, verses 34 to 40 of his gospel, when asked for his view of the most important commandment and its interpretation by an expert of the Jewish law, being perfectly aware that there were 10 good commandments to choose from, Jesus did an extraordinary thing. He ignored them all and came up with something else. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, he said. And then, just to add insult to injury, having been asked for only one, he went on unprompted to offer a second. Love your neighbour as yourself. He took the first of these two great principles from Deuteronomy chapter 6, the chapter after the Ten Commandments, and the second from a completely different book, from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. What Jesus was really saying was, love God, love others as you love yourself, that's it. All the rest is window dressing. Every other religious precept or rule is really just an attempt to contextualize what love looks like in practice in a given cultural setting. Love is the big picture. Now, the religious leaders of Jesus' day were all terribly worried about this. If you give up on the rules, you'll be giving up on discipline. They didn't take well to the way in which he ignored their time-honoured interpretations of Scripture. As far as they were concerned, Jesus' views, indeed his whole way of life, was blasphemous and heretical, which is why they wanted him silenced. But Jesus knew that life is not primarily about rules. The big picture is love. He understood that rather than living by endless rules, taking them at face value and mindlessly applying them without any thought of their original context or purpose, what God really wants is for people to live within the spirit rather than the letter of the rules. Jesus was trying to get his learned questioner to recognize that the law was never enough. Love is the big picture. Laws might be a useful guide in some circumstances, but the rules will not always be relevant to every time and every place. And indeed, there'll often be no actual rule for a specific situation that we're facing. But the core principles behind the rules, mercy, justice, faithfulness, generosity, compassion, patience, integrity, courage, self-control, which are all simply outworkings of and other ways of saying love, are constantly applicable to life because they flow directly from the story of the giver of life, the God of love. The way I see it, this is the big picture on the lid of life, and therefore any bits of theology, doctrine or church dogma that don't fit with this don't fit at all. Love God, love others the way you love yourself. That's it. Everything else is simply an outworking of these two great fundamentals. And if the pieces of the jigsaw don't fit, then they don't belong. So some questions. Does this make sense? Which bits of the picture of Christianity that you've been taught don't fit with this? Is that because they're wrong or because I'm wrong? More next week.